It opened up like a lot, I was able to get surgery. I was actually, it was much better than stable, in my opinion, in terms of the actual results for the trial. So my clinical trial experience was fantastic. It really changed everything about my disease, but it definitely was not the, okay, we're looking for a cure at this time. Hi, everyone. I am Julie Clauer. I am a stage 4 colorectal cancer patient. I was diagnosed stage 4 in March of 2018 with liver mets. And since then, I've had cancer jump throughout pretty much everywhere: lung, liver, lymph nodes, bone, everywhere. So I've had active disease the whole 5 years, and started participating in a clinical trial in July of 2020 and was on it for 2.5 years, and it completely changed the trajectory of my disease. And I might actually in 2 weeks have my first no evidence of disease scans. So we're hoping that after all these years, I'm finally net.
My name is Allison Rosen. I am a stage 2 colorectal cancer survivor and very, very passionate advocate. I've worked in the field of oncology for about 17 years and went through colorectal cancer 10 years ago, and have been an advocate ever since I was in remission. I was adolescent young adult patient when I was diagnosed. It's just, there's I wouldn't say epidemic, but there's something going on. We're trying to figure out why. Not myself, but a lot of researchers and oncologists and people are trying to figure out why.
So I'd agree with you, first of all, Allison, that this is epidemic, I think, is actually a really good word, right? It's rising worldwide. We don't know why it's happening, but it's this steady rise that we see from year to year. So it's the tricky thing is, and the challenge is, so we opened centers dedicated to young people under the age of 50 with colorectal cancer, really for 2 reasons. One is for the research question, to try to get data to figure out why this is happening. And then the second is to help our patients navigate this disease from diagnosis through treatment and then into survivorship, because each stage is critically important and has different and unique challenges in our young patients, as everyone here is well aware. And the clinical trials piece is a really important question, but part of the issue is we believe that this disease, as best as we can tell, is the same disease once someone has it. There might be some slight nuanced differences, but in terms of sort of the treatment that we have available now, our chemotherapy, our trials, it's for all ages. There's nothing specifically for early onset colorectal cancer, because the disease, once it's present in any stage, really behaves very similarly. So, but young patients themselves, as the question asked, are more motivated. Perhaps they're more eager to kind of participate in trials and think about the next steps. I think it depends on the person very much, but I guess as a group, that's probably true. So the challenge for us is, although someone is motivated, it's not always easy to talk about trials, to offer trials, because sometimes standard of care is better, which is an important thing to acknowledge and think about too, that we do have, certain good treatments that are already accepted as standard of care. Once a trial is considered, and as Julie really nicely outlined, there's trials for every stage. So it is an important thing to keep in mind, especially with our young patients. And often I think for us, that's a challenge in and of itself. But, I think it's just it's important to educate our patients, any age, but especially our young patients, in terms of, these are the biomarkers, these are the potential things that we're going to be thinking about targeting in the future. We'll talk a little bit about this later in terms of what's hot and what's up and coming in colorectal cancer. But if someone has a specific mutation, I'll often say, listen, you have this, we're not going to think about this now, but this might be something that we'll think about a trial in the future. Or there's an exciting new trial with combination immunotherapy. We don't need it right now, but that's something that we'll think about. And so the challenge is always, I'm ready now. And oftentimes I'll tell you, listen, you're in a really good spot. You don't need anything right now because we don't have anything. The chemo that you're on is actually working. Once, of course, we see that it's not working, then we think about, what are the next steps. But I think the most important and the succinct answer is just to really keep an open line of communication at every point, certainly at every scan, as much as possible at every visit, to make sure that the patient, the caregivers, everyone is informed that these are the possibilities that we might be thinking about at some point.
We're going to start and talk a little bit about clinical trials 101. People have all sorts of knowledge about clinical trials, little, a lot when they go in. So we want to ask Dr. Cercek to start. When we talk about clinical trials, there are a lot of sort of misconceptions. What are some misconceptions you've heard? I know one that I've heard that people reach out to me as an advocate saying they think clinical trials are a last resort only for the very sickest patients, but they aren't, are they?
No, definitely not. Clinical trials come kind of basically in all shapes and sizes and in all stages. And so that's a really, really important point because, that's often what people feel is like, well, it's last resort and I'm a guinea pig and why should I really do this? Will this really matter at that point? But in fact, our trials happen in early stage disease, which we'll hear from Kelly. They can be as a first line treatment, meaning as a first time treatment. When someone is first diagnosed, even with advanced disease, where the goal of the trial really is like, okay, we do a decent job. How can we improve this by maybe with adding a new medication to a standard treatment or changing the medications completely based on data from studies in advanced disease. So it's important to run these trials in all stages to really find out which drugs work and at what stage they work best to help patients. So that's a really, really important point, Allison, that we really need to kind of distill, because it's critical for people to think about clinical trials, to consider clinical trials, because that's really what helps move science forward. That's really what makes advances. Even all the drugs that we have now were at one point in a clinical trial and had to be tested in people in order to get that approval. We have super strict approvals in the US and in Europe, actually really everywhere for, all drugs, but especially for oncology drugs. And then that's how we get their approval is through clinical trials.
I think that last point is one of the things that most people have no idea about. So thanks so much for sharing that sort of misconception and a little bit more understanding of clinical trials in general, all different stages, all different shapes, all different sizes. So David, I want to ask you a question. You speak to patients all the time, you interact. What are some of the questions and misconceptions about clinical trials that you hear? We heard about one about last resort. Is there anything else you'd want to add that are misconceptions that you hear?
Oh, yeah. The one I hear probably the most is patients are afraid if they go on a clinical trial, they're going to be given a placebo. And in oncology, that is not true. In other diseases, that can be true. That is, but in oncology, the care that you would get would be the standard of care for your disease at your particular stage, and also depending on your biomarker status. So that's really important to understand that. But there's all sorts of concerns that patients have from, how do I find a trial to, is there a trial near me? What are the costs of a trial and who pays for the different aspects of that? If you participate, how is that going to alter the fact, the schedule when you have to go to the doctor or the site where the clinical trial is being conducted? And, do you need more tests? Do you need more, just more tests, more imaging, that sort of thing. And so it's really, I think a lot of people don't truly understand it. When you go in, it's a very regimented thing. You will learn exactly what's going to happen. And you can ask questions of your doctor so that you can understand exactly what you're getting yourself into by possibly participating in a trial. And it's everything is your decision, and you can withdraw from a clinical trial at any time. So this is really about you and the care that you can get through these new therapies or new combinations that are being developed.
So next we're going to move on to Julie. And Julie, we want to hear a little bit more about you and your clinical trial experience and how did you learn about it, and how much did you know before, and sort of what are you doing as far as a trial, but to help others now.
So I think it depends a lot on where you are in your care, right? And so every point that changes. But I would say overall, right, the long-term goal and the desire is always is always cure. I think everybody who has cancer, right? That's our yeah, if you can cure me, great. But when you look at kind of where I was in treatment, I was on third, fourth-ish line, depending on how you feel about re-challenges. I was, my body was very depleted. My blood count numbers weren't doing so good. My platelets were low. I was kind of in this place where my body wasn't necessarily in a healthy spot. And you have to be healthy enough to do trials. So one of the reasons why I was told not to go for that I couldn't wait 6 weeks wasn't because the cancer was out of control. It was because I probably wouldn't be healthy enough to participate in a clinical trial. So that's another reason why not to leave them for last resort. But when you kind of are in that moment, I wasn't giving up on the idea of cure long term. So at that time, I decided not to do the clinical trial. But then every time kind of I was in treatment, I knew with stage 4 and as extensive as the disease I had, I knew that probably the first line of treatment wasn't going to work forever, and I knew that this wasn't going to be a one-shot deal for me. Every time I'd go into my oncologist, sometimes I'd find out about clinical trials from Town. I'd, hear about something from another patient, or my doctor would tell me about something he was working on that was really exciting. And so we kind of dribbled the clinical trial conversation in, where I'd bring something on an appointment and just say, hey, I heard about this trial. What do you think? And just get his opinion. And so it kind of was like talking about clinical trials and learning about clinical trials 2 minutes at a time over a long period of time. So anytime I got, news of progression and I needed a treatment change, we'd already kind of have a set of what would be next. So I always wanted to have a few options. So the clinical trial I ended up going on was kind of always in that short list. And it was like, okay, we can go to this second line, or we can do this trial, or we can, do et cetera, or go do surgery. And so this trial was one that was kind of on the docket for a long time. And so I actually learned a lot about it. I learned how the early results were going. I learned probably almost too much about it, because by the time it was time to go on it, the trial was not looking very good in terms of the results. So from a research perspective, it didn't meet its endpoint. It was not a good trial, and as it turns out. And at the time, it looked like it was going in that direction. But I had progression, and I also was really exhausted. I'd had over 60 chemo treatments. I had over 5 open surgeries. I had multiple radiation. My body was just worn out. And so when it came time to decide what was next, I could have gone on the last line of standard care chemotherapy, a third line treatment that was available, or I had 2 trials that were in my mix. So those were kind of my 3 at the time that were exciting. So trial number 1, trial number 2, and then the standard of care. And when I went in to my doctor, we were talking about the trial that I ended up going on, and it was a better option than the standard of care option at the time for me. But we talked about the fact that it wasn't going to probably change the trajectory of my disease. I wasn't going to be cured from it. I said, okay, well, that's not an option. So I'm going to go with number 2. And again, I just was looking for kind of a range of stability, and I ended up on it stable for 2.5 years. It opened up like a lot, I was able to get surgery. I was actually, it was much better than stable, in my opinion, in terms of the actual results for the trial. It was stable. But I think it just goes to show that, like, you have to know what you're looking for, and also have some options. And I really think making that decision without like having the panic of trying to learn everything about it at that moment, because those moments are really scary. And having somebody else who can help talk you through it is fantastic, but also not having to have all that thrown at you at a time when you're really, really scared and trying to figure out the logistics and everything while you're in that moment, I think was key for me. So it really changed everything about my disease, but it definitely was not okay, we're looking for a cure at this time.
Having the open line of communication is huge, and trust, and patients can do their research, but also, the doctors and trusting their oncologists need to also, again, share decision making. It's about what's best at that time. And younger people, yeah, we might be eager, but we got to trust in the process. And you brought up a good point about trials and finding them, and And so I think the next question I want David to answer is something that we got in ahead of time from a patient. How do you get started on a trial and or find trials and register? How often should a patient be searching?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So clinicaltrials.gov was just brought up. That is a website run by the government that lists all clinical trials that are available. That can be a little bit undaunting to navigate through. It's a fairly complicated site, but certainly that's the place where you're going to get the most. And you just have to use different search strategy to get there. But there are tools out there that you can use. You don't have to necessarily do it yourself. We have a system called Blue HQ. That's at bluehq.org. It's basically a patient portal that allows you to learn more about your disease, especially if you understand your biomarkers, allows you to enter data into their platform, and then they will try to do the trial matching for you. And of course, they'll contact you if you are eligible for a trial, talk to you about, where the trial is being conducted, that sort of thing, and then to see if you're interested. Again, you're just trying to find it for you if you want. As far as frequency, I'll tell you, there is so much going on right now in colorectal cancer. When you look at, new types of drugs that are coming out, antibody drug conjugates is one. If you think about new immunotherapies and how do you turn cold tumors that do not respond to immunotherapies like PD-1, PD-L1 therapies, and how do you turn those into hot tumors so that they would respond then to those immunotherapeutic drugs. There's also opportunities for things such like oncological vaccines. So there's all sorts of things happening. So yes, on a daily basis, there could be a new trial. But really, I think it's more important to either work with somebody, your oncologist, and let them know you're interested, and they can certainly help with trying to find the right trial for you. And if the oncologist, because not all oncologists are comfortable with clinical trials, especially in the rural parts of the country, then there are resources that you can reach out to online that would allow you to keep track of it more closely. And you can work with other companies that can do clinical trial matching for you. They're on the web, so they're available.
The great answer and great information, but I want you to expand a little bit more because we got another question before this asked about, does insurance cover clinical trials? How does one pay? So we really want you to talk a little bit more. And I know Blue HQ is an amazing resource. Can we find information about costs, insurance, travel, childcare? Because oftentimes people can't just pick up and go, yes, there might be a trial down the street from them, but there might be, the best trial might be 500 miles away from them or 1,000 miles away from them.
There are some things that are covered by the sponsor of the clinical trial. So certainly the study drug is covered. Any lab tests that are related to any endpoints that aren't maybe the primary endpoint. So research purposes, so they maybe can find a biomarker that goes along with this particular therapy. Those are paid by the sponsor. Any extra x-rays or imaging, anything like that, that the sponsor would ask to be done so that they can be monitoring the response to the therapy on the clinical trial very closely, that would also be covered by the sponsors. But anything else, pretty much, the doctor's visits, the hospital stays, regular lab tests, regular imaging that would be part of standard of care, your insurance would pay for. Now, some of the sponsors do provide some support for things such as transportation, housing, food, and childcare. Plus, there are other resources like the Colorectal Cancer Alliance, where we also have resources where we can help patients with some of these financial toxicity needs. So, and we also have, also at the Alliance, we have navigators that can help you get through this process, not just of finding a clinical trial, but also then navigating how you can participate in a clinical trial based on some of the challenges that you are having. And there are people out there to help, and the Alliance is there to help you. Again, bluehq.org, and we also have a phone number.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, I think you shouldn't let cost or fear or other things stop you from investigating and thinking about trials. So we want to know, Dr. Cercek, Can you talk about the role of biomarkers? And first of all, what is a biomarker? Because a lot of people might not know, but the role of biomarkers in clinical trials and how they can guide personalized treatment.
Absolutely. So biomarker, I would say at this point is probably one of the most important pieces in terms of clinical trials and just in general treatment of colorectal cancer. And definitely in advanced disease, but even in early stage as it's becoming increasingly more important. So a biomarker basically is a change in the tumor, like a mutation, where we have a potential drug for. So important biomarkers in colorectal cancer are things like mismatch repair deficiency or MSI, where we can use immunotherapy or we can use other combinations that are tested in clinical trials. Super important biomarkers include things like BRAF, V600Es in particular, but BRAF is good enough to remember. We've made progress with BRAF targeting in clinical trials. There's now an approved therapy, but we're trying to do better. So it's a really, really important marker in terms of treatment, in terms of trials as well. And then another one, which used to be a huge challenge actually, and is now we're really making progress and is really exciting, is KRAS or RAS. And so typically when we hear RAS mutated, we think, okay, there's a treatment that we can't use. We can't use anti-EGFR therapy, but actually now there are RAS inhibitors or RAS targeted therapies. So RAS is the biomarker, and then we have a targeted therapy for different types of KRAS. You might have heard KRAS G12C. That's kind of the new kid on the block, really exciting. We just recently had very good data in terms of responses when treating this particular type of mutation or type of biomarker in colon cancer. A newer one is G12D that's now in clinical trials. And so that's a super important thing to think about and to test. And really most importantly, and Allison, you mentioned this, but it's something that everyone should have done, when they're diagnosed for start of diagnosis, so that we kind of know what the landscape is and know what we can do, even not even thinking about clinical trials, just standard of care. Another really important one that is, I think, super exciting is HER2, or what's called ERBB2. So we've heard about that a lot. We've studied that a lot in breast cancer and in stomach cancer, but now we're seeing that combinations actually work in colon cancer as well. So there are ongoing trials looking at it in advanced disease and first-line treatment. So when people are first diagnosed, why it's really important to know those biomarkers right away with HER2 targeting, because it is a very, very good biomarker for which we have a really good drug. So there's a number of these, biomarkers that we need to know. And so what we really encourage is we encourage next generation sequencing of the tumor, know the mutational landscape. You can do it from the tumor. We could even do it from the blood and what's called circulating tumor DNA. There's lots of different ways to get it done, but super important for everyone, to speak with their oncologist and have that done if you don't already know that information.
So asking about biomarker testing, circulating tumor DNA, there's so personalized medicine is so important now. Back when I was diagnosed, it was standard of care. It was radiation, chemo, surgery, chemo. Like a lot of this was sort of on the horizon, but things have changed over the past few years in such an exciting way. So you can treat the specific mutation or the tumor of that person. So asking those questions is like one of the most important things right there. And I think, even a few years ago, it was one mutation that had maybe a trial to it. So now all these, there's research ongoing, there's trials ongoing for a lot of this. So really have that conversation with your doctor. And if you don't know, if you're sitting here and you don't know, that's the first question you ask your care team tomorrow. Like send them a message, call their team, and if they haven't done it or they haven't told you about genetic testing or biomarker testing or circulating tumor DNA testing, like have that conversation, because that could change the trajectory of your whole treatment. That you can find a trial that would work for you. It might not be where you're at right now. It might be somewhere else. So that's my soapbox. And
I have to add a quick soapbox on that, because I totally agree. Biomarkers are so critical. But as a vanilla girl who's wild type with no targetable mutations, not having a mutation is valuable information as well. And there's a lot of trials that are available to you too. Because a lot of people will say, I don't have any of those mutations, so I'm out of luck. No, you are not. And I'm proof of that right here.
Julie, thank you for that point. That's super important. There are many, many, many studies, many drugs, many trials, many different ways of targeting colorectal cancer. So biomarker is just one of them, but not, not having any being wild type. There's lots of stuff out there. There's different ways that drugs can enter the cell that have nothing to do with the mutation, that are also explored and making progress. So thank you for that point. I think that's really critical. But super important just to know your mutational landscape. Even that wild type makes a big difference for standard of care too. So I would say, the most important thing is you can be and should be your own advocate, as you've heard here from everyone. Speak up for yourself, open that line of communication, and make sure if you're having trouble, let your oncologist know. If you have questions, it's okay. There was a question about being annoying. It's not annoying. You could just ask the questions, be your own advocate. And you're in this fight together. And I think that's the most important way to think about this and to approach this disease.
I would say the biggest message is really a clinical trial could be out there that is just right for you at your stage in your disease progress. Do not be afraid of the fact that it's research. These are drugs that have gone through extensive preclinical testing. And once they get into clinical trials, there is a series of clinical trials in the way they phase them so that they know all of the profiles and everything as far as side effects and that sort of thing. So, could be the best standard of care that you could get, and keep an open mind.
I'd say that there's no perfect trial for everybody, right? They're all studies. They're all trying to learn. So really knowing yourself and trying to kind of have those conversations, understand what you're willing to do. Are you willing to travel? All that stuff before you need to make the decision. Because when you get to that point of having to make the decision, you don't have enough time necessarily to make the best decision you can.